Bride's family mocks groom's black grandmother. Then they get the shock of their lives. Welcome to Tales by Ezra. Let's uncover what really happened. The late afternoon sun, a painter of soft gold and long shadows, spilled through the lace-curtained windows of Eleanor Vance's small, meticulously kept cottage. At 74, Eleanor moved with a gentle grace that belied the strength in her spirit, a strength honed by a life rich in experience, though modest in material possessions. Her home, filled with the scent of lavender polish and freshly baked bread, was a testament to her quiet order and her love for simple beauty. Books lined the shelves, their spines worn from countless readings, and a grand, albeit slightly out of tune, upright piano stood in the corner, a silent keeper of melodies from her youth. Eleanor was a woman of profound kindness, her eyes, the color of warm honey, reflecting a deep well of empathy and a keen, though often unvoiced, understanding of human nature. She had buried a beloved husband, raised a successful son, and now found her greatest joy in her grandson, Michael, a young man whose heart was as good as his prospects were bright. Michael was getting married. The news had filled Eleanor with a quiet happiness, a sense of life's beautiful, enduring cycle. His fiancée, Jessica, was a sweet-natured girl, an artist with a shy smile and kind eyes. Eleanor had liked her instantly during their few, brief meetings. The wedding was to be a grand affair, hosted by Jessica's family, the Penningtons, whom Eleanor had yet to meet. Michael had spoken of them with a certain carefulness, describing them as rather traditional and very keen on appearances, phrases that Eleanor, with her gentle wisdom, had translated accurately. She understood that the world Michael was marrying into was different from the one she inhabited, a world where lineage and legacy were often measured in stock portfolios and social registers rather than in acts of kindness or the richness of one's character. As she carefully pressed her best dress, a simple but elegant navy blue silk she had owned for years, a sense of quiet anticipation mingled with an almost imperceptible tremor of apprehension. She wasn't concerned for herself. She had faced far greater challenges in her life than navigating the subtle currents of social scrutiny. Her concern, if any, was for Michael, for his happiness, and for the hope that Jessica's family would see beyond the surface, would recognize the true worth of the young man their daughter had chosen. Eleanor believed in the inherent goodness of people, but she was not naive. She knew that prejudice wore many masks, and that judgments, swift and often unfair, could be cast like stones. She packed a small, embroidered clutch, her late husband's pocket watch nestled beside a lace handkerchief, a small tin of her famous lemon drops, and a miniature, leather-bound volume of poetry, her companions for any journey. Her preparations were unhurried, imbued with a sense of occasion, but also with an unshakable self-possession. She was Eleanor Vance, a woman who had lived a full life, who knew her own worth, and who needed no one's validation to feel complete. The Penningtons, she surmised, would be an experience. She hoped, for Michael's sake, it would be a pleasant one. But if not, she would face it as she had faced everything else in her life, with dignity, with grace, and with an unwavering belief in the quiet power of being true to oneself. The invitation to the rehearsal dinner, embossed on heavy cream cardstock, lay on her polished hall table. It was to be held at an exclusive country club, a place whose name whispered of old money and exclusivity. Eleanor smiled faintly. It seemed the Penningtons were indeed keen on making a statement. She only hoped their statement would include a warm welcome for their new grandson-in-law's only living grandparent. The train journey to the city where the wedding festivities were being held was smooth, and Eleanor enjoyed watching the countryside slip by, her thoughts a gentle river of memories and hopes. She thought of her son, Michael's father, lost too soon, but living on in Michael's kind eyes and steady character. She thought of her own youth, filled with music and dreams, some realized, others gently laid to rest. She was not a woman given to regrets, preferring to find the lessons and the beauty in every chapter of her life. As the train pulled into the bustling city station, she felt a familiar sense of resilience. She was ready. Whatever awaited her at the Penningtons' rehearsal dinner, she would meet it with the quiet strength that was her signature. Her love for Michael was her armor, her dignity her shield. The Penningtons might be a different world, but Eleanor Vance was a universe unto herself. The real question was whether they would have the wisdom to see it. The Willow Creek Country Club exuded an aura of hushed opulence, its manicured lawns stretching towards a grand colonial-style clubhouse, its windows glowing with a warm, exclusive light. Eleanor Vance, escorted by her grandson Michael, stepped out of the modest taxi, her simple navy dress a quiet statement of elegance amidst the anticipated finery. Michael squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Ready, Grandma?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness he was trying to conceal. Eleanor smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "As I'll ever be, my dear." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and a murmur of polite, carefully modulated conversations. Jessica hurried towards them, her face flushed, her smile a little too bright. "Grandma Eleanor." "Michael, I'm so glad you're here." She pecked Eleanor on the cheek, then glanced nervously over her shoulder towards a formidable-looking woman holding court near a massive stone fireplace. "Mom, Dad, Clara," Jessica called, beckoning them over. Beatrice Pennington, Jessica's mother, approached with the regal bearing of a woman accustomed to being the center of attention. Her diamonds glittered, her gown was couture, and her smile, as she extended a perfectly manicured hand towards Eleanor, did not quite reach her cold, appraising eyes. "Ah, Mrs. Vance. So pleased you could make it," she said, her tone a shade too patronizing, her handshake brief and dismissive. Arthur Pennington, a portly man with a florid complexion and an air of self-importance, offered a cursory nod. "Welcome, welcome," he boomed, his gaze already scanning the room for more important arrivals. Clara, Jessica's younger sister, a striking brunette with her mother's sharp features and an even sharper tongue, merely offered a tight, insincere smile, her eyes openly assessing Eleanor's attire with a look that bordered on disdain. The subtle onslaught began almost immediately. "Oh, Mrs. Vance," Beatrice cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "That's a very charming dress. So classic." The unspoken old-fashioned hung in the air. Eleanor simply smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Pennington. It has served me well for many happy occasions." Clara, never one for subtlety, chimed in. "I suppose you don't get out to places like Willow Creek very often, do you, Mrs. Vance?" Her tone implied that Eleanor was a fish out of water, a creature from a less rarefied ecosystem. Michael stiffened, but before he could speak, Eleanor replied smoothly, "Young lady, I've found that true enjoyment isn't dictated by the postcode of a place, but by the company one keeps." Clara looked momentarily taken aback, then recovered with a small, dismissive sniff. As they were led to their table, a large, circular one dominated by the Penningtons and their closest, equally affluent friends, the scrutiny continued. Eleanor found herself the subject of curious, sidelong glances and hushed whispers. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken questions about her background, her means, her suitability as an in-law to the esteemed Pennington family. The conversation at the table was a relentless parade of name-dropping, discussions of exotic holidays, and critiques of the latest society scandals. Eleanor listened politely, contributing little, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the loud, self-congratulatory chatter around her. When the wine was poured, Arthur Pennington made a show of inspecting the label. "Excellent vintage," he declared, "though perhaps a bit robust for some palates. Mrs. Vance?" He winked, as if sharing an inside joke that Eleanor couldn't possibly comprehend. Eleanor, who had cultivated a small but impressive vineyard with her late husband and knew more about oenology than Arthur Pennington would ever guess, simply replied, "It has a lovely bouquet, Mr. Pennington. I'm sure it's delightful." Her refusal to be drawn, to be either intimidated or impressed, seemed to irk them. Beatrice, determined to establish her social superiority, began to question Eleanor about her life. "So, Mrs. Vance," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the table, "Michael tells us you live, quite simply. A little cottage, is it?" The implication was clear. Simple meant insignificant. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice calm. "A small cottage, filled with a great deal of love and many happy memories. It is all I need." "How quaint," Beatrice murmured, exchanging a knowing glance with one of her equally snobbish friends, a woman dripping in pearls who had been eyeing Eleanor with unconcealed curiosity. The meal progressed, each course an opportunity for further subtle condescension. When the complex array of silverware was laid out, Clara made a point of saying, loudly, "Oh, Mother, do you remember that dreadful little restaurant we went to in Provence? They had hardly any cutlery at all. So terribly provincial." She glanced at Eleanor, as if expecting her to be bewildered by the assortment of forks and knives. Eleanor, who had dined in embassies and staterooms during her late husband's diplomatic career, merely selected the correct fish fork with an unruffled ease that seemed to disappoint Clara. Michael, sitting beside Eleanor, was growing increasingly agitated. He shot warning glances at his new in-laws, tried to steer the conversation to safer topics, but the Penningtons, enjoying their perceived social advantage, were relentless. Jessica looked miserable, torn between loyalty to her family and embarrassment at their appalling behavior. Eleanor, however, remained a beacon of calm in the storm of their snobbery. She ate sparingly, spoke only when addressed directly, and met every barbed comment with a quiet grace that was, in its own way, a powerful rebuke. She knew their game. She had seen it played out countless times in countless drawing rooms and boardrooms. It was the insecure trying to assert their dominance, the shallow trying to mask their emptiness with a display of material wealth. And Eleanor Vance was neither impressed nor intimidated. She was simply waiting for them to reveal the full extent of their ignorance, waiting for the moment when their carefully constructed facade of superiority would inevitably, as all such facades do, begin to crack. The rehearsal dinner wore on, a marathon of forced pleasantries and thinly veiled condescension. The Penningtons, it seemed, were warming to their theme, their casual dismissal of Eleanor growing bolder with each passing course and each refilled champagne flute. Beatrice, in particular, seemed to relish the opportunity to highlight what she perceived as Eleanor's social deficiencies. "And your hobbies, Mrs. Vance?" she inquired, her tone that of a naturalist examining a peculiar new species. "I imagine your days are rather quiet." "I enjoy reading, Mrs. Pennington," Eleanor replied, her voice even. "And I tend a small garden. I also play the piano, though mostly for my own pleasure these days." "Gardening? How rustic," Beatrice trilled, as if Eleanor had confessed to something slightly unsanitary. "And the piano? Just little tunes, I suppose? Nothing too strenuous?" The implication that Eleanor's musical abilities were likely limited to simple ditties was not lost on Michael, whose grandmother had once been a concert-level pianist before dedicating her life to her family and her husband's demanding career. He opened his mouth to correct her, a flush rising on his neck, but Eleanor laid a gentle hand on his arm, a silent signal to let it pass. She merely smiled at Beatrice. "Music is a universal language, Mrs. Pennington. It speaks to the heart, regardless of complexity." Her response, serene and thoughtful, seemed to momentarily deflate Beatrice, who preferred her targets to be flustered or defensive. Arthur Pennington, meanwhile, was regaling the table with a lengthy anecdote about a recent business trip to Zurich, emphasizing the opulence of his hotel and the importance of the financiers he had met. "One must, of course, move in the right circles," he declared, puffing out his chest. "Connections, you know. That's what separates the men from the boys, eh?" He glanced at Eleanor, clearly expecting her to be suitably impressed by his worldly pronouncements. Eleanor listened patiently, then remarked, "Indeed, Mr. Pennington, true connections, the ones built on mutual respect and integrity, are invaluable." Her emphasis on true and integrity was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a quiet weight that Arthur, in his self-congratulatory haze, completely missed. Clara, not to be outdone in the snobbery stakes, turned the conversation to the wedding gifts. "We've received the most fabulous things, haven't we, Jessica?" she gushed, conveniently ignoring her sister's pained expression. "Crystal from Waterford, silver from Tiffany's. Of course, one expects a certain standard." She then looked directly at Eleanor. "I do hope you managed to find something appropriate, Mrs. Vance. Wedding registries can be so helpful for those who aren't quite sure about these things." The insult was blatant, a direct insinuation that Eleanor was both ignorant of social etiquette and likely incapable of affording a suitable gift. This time, Michael couldn't restrain himself. "Clara," he interjected, his voice sharp, "Grandma's presence here is the only gift we need, and her taste is impeccable." Clara merely raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a small, malicious smile playing on her lips. "Of course, Michael. How sentimental." Eleanor, however, remained unruffled. She looked at Clara with a calm, steady gaze that held no anger, only a touch of pity. "A gift, my dear Clara," she said softly, "is a token of love and good wishes. Its value lies in the heart of the giver, not in its price tag or its brand name." Her quiet dignity seemed to infuriate Clara further. "Well, I suppose some people have to tell themselves that," she retorted, her voice laced with sarcasm. The atmosphere at the table had grown palpably tense. Even some of Beatrice's sycophantic friends were beginning to look uncomfortable at the relentless targeting of the elderly woman. Jessica looked as though she might burst into tears, her earlier excitement about the wedding now completely extinguished by her family's boorish behavior. Towards the end of the meal, as coffee was being served, Beatrice delivered what she clearly considered her coup de grace. She leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice loud enough for the entire table to hear. "You know, Mrs. Vance," she said, "we were a little surprised when Michael told us about you. We naturally assumed, well, with his background, his education, that his family would be, shall we say, more established." The implication was clear. Eleanor, and by extension Michael's side of the family, was not of their class, not of their world. They were an unfortunate appendage, a social liability to be endured rather than embraced. Eleanor met Beatrice's gaze directly. Her expression was unreadable, a calm surface above unfathomable depths. She took a slow sip of her coffee, then placed the cup carefully back on its saucer. "Mrs. Pennington," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a sudden, unexpected authority that made everyone at the table fall silent. "My family has been established in this country for many generations. We have served it in times of war and contributed to it in times of peace. We have valued education, integrity, and kindness above all else. Our legacy may not be measured in stock portfolios or social registers, but it is a legacy of which I and my grandson are immensely proud." There was a stunned silence. Beatrice Pennington, for the first time that evening, looked genuinely disconcerted. She had expected meekness, perhaps even shame. She had not expected this quiet, unshakable assertion of worth. Eleanor didn't raise her voice, didn't resort to anger or accusations. She simply stated her truth, and in doing so, she exposed the hollowness of their snobbery. The cracks in their facade were beginning to show, and Eleanor knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the real revelations were yet to come. The Penningtons had mistaken her gentle nature for weakness, her quiet dignity for insignificance. They were about to learn, in a most unforgettable way, just how wrong they were. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a picture-perfect day that seemed to mock the underlying tensions simmering within the Pennington and Vance families. Eleanor rose early, as was her habit, and spent a quiet hour in contemplation, her thoughts on Michael and Jessica and the commitment they were about to make. She dressed with care, her navy silk dress now augmented by a small, antique pearl brooch, her something old, and a delicate lace shawl her mother had crocheted. She looked every inch the distinguished matriarch, her bearing regal despite her simple attire. at the sprawling Pennington estate. However, the atmosphere was one of frantic activity and frayed nerves. Beatrice was issuing a barrage of orders to a beleaguered team of florists, caterers, and wedding planners, her voice sharp with anxiety. Arthur was pacing the library, muttering about the importance of everything going flawlessly. Clara was flitting between her own preparations and offering unsolicited, often critical, advice to her sister. Jessica, pale and stressed, was trying to maintain a semblance of bridal serenity, but the weight of her family's expectations and her acute embarrassment over their treatment of Eleanor was taking its toll. When Eleanor arrived, driven by a quiet, respectful Michael, the Penningtons' attempts at condescension resumed, albeit with a slightly less confident edge after Eleanor's firm rebuttal the previous evening. Beatrice, encountering Eleanor in the grand hallway, remarked, "Oh, Mrs. Vance, you're early. The bridal suite is rather crowded at the moment. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the small conservatory? We've put some magazines there for you." The implication was clear. Eleanor was not considered part of the intimate inner circle of bridal preparations. "Thank you, Mrs. Pennington," Eleanor replied, unfazed. "The conservatory sounds lovely. A little quiet contemplation before the ceremony will be most welcome." Her calm acceptance seemed to further annoy Beatrice, who had perhaps hoped for a display of offense. Later, there was a minor but telling incident regarding the seating plan for the reception. Clara, brandishing the chart with an air of authority, pointed to a table near the back, close to the service entrance. "Mrs. Vance, we've placed you here," she announced, her tone suggesting it was a great favor. "It's a cozy little spot. You'll be able to see everything eventually." Michael, who had been observing the exchange, stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Absolutely not, Clara," he said, his voice dangerously low. "My grandmother will be seated at the main family table, with me and Jessica. That is non-negotiable." Clara scoffed. "But Michael, that table is for immediate family, and our most distinguished guests." "My grandmother is my immediate family, Clara," Michael retorted, his eyes flashing. "And I assure you, she is more distinguished than anyone you could possibly imagine." A tense silence fell. Beatrice and Arthur, drawn by the raised voices, hurried over. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice demanded. Michael stood his ground. "I'm simply ensuring that my grandmother is treated with the respect she deserves. She will sit with us, or this wedding will not proceed as planned." The ultimatum hung in the air, shocking the Penningtons into momentary speechlessness. Arthur, ever the pragmatist when faced with a genuine threat to his carefully orchestrated event, quickly intervened. Now, Michael, my boy, no need for such dramatics. Of course, Mrs. Vance will sit wherever you wish. A slight oversight on Clara's part, that's all." He shot a venomous glare at his younger daughter. Clara looked mutinous but subsided, realizing she had overplayed her hand. Eleanor, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, placed a gentle hand on Michael's arm. "Thank you, my dear," she said softly. "But please, don't let me be the cause of any distress on this happy day. I am content wherever I am seated, as long as I can witness your happiness." Her grace in the face of their continued pettiness only served to highlight their own lack of it. As the time for the ceremony approached, the guests began to arrive, a glittering assembly of the city's social elite. The Penningtons were in their element, greeting their friends with effusive warmth, their earlier tensions momentarily forgotten in the excitement of the occasion. Eleanor observed them from a quiet corner, a small, almost invisible figure in the sea of designer gowns and bespoke suits. She saw the carefully constructed masks, the practiced smiles, the subtle jockeying for social position. It was a world she knew, a world she had navigated with her late husband, a world whose superficialities had always amused and sometimes saddened her. She knew that beneath the glittering surface, there were often currents of insecurity, of fear, of a desperate need for validation. The Penningtons, for all their wealth and social standing, were no exception. They were, in their own way, trapped by the very image they sought to project. As she watched them, A sense of profound peace settled over her. She had nothing to prove, nothing to gain, nothing to lose. She was there for Michael, to witness his joy, to offer her silent blessing. And she knew, with a quiet certainty, that before this day was over, the Penningtons' carefully ordered world was about to be irrevocably and hilariously upended. The shock she had been subtly anticipating was drawing nearer, not as a clap of thunder, but as a quiet, inexorable tide. The wedding ceremony itself was a beautiful affair, held in the Penningtons' meticulously landscaped gardens under a canopy of white roses. Jessica, despite her earlier stress, looked radiant as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Michael, waiting at the altar, had eyes only for her, his love and happiness evident to all. Eleanor watched from her seat, now prominently placed in the front row, thanks to Michael's earlier insistence. Her heart filled with a quiet joy for her grandson. She offered a silent prayer for their future, for their happiness, for their enduring love. Even the Penningtons, caught up in the emotion of the moment, seemed to momentarily forget their snobbery, dabbing at their eyes with silk handkerchiefs as their daughter exchanged her vows. But the truce, if it could even be called that, was short-lived. The reception, held in a vast, opulent marquee on the estate grounds, provided a fresh battleground for their social pretensions. The champagne flowed freely, the orchestra played Vivaldi, and the air buzzed with the chatter of the city's elite. The Penningtons, now back in their element, circulated among their guests, their arrogance reasserting itself with every glass of champagne consumed. Eleanor, seated at the main table between Michael and a rather flustered Jessica, found herself once again the target of their subtle and not-so-subtle barbs. Beatrice, leaning across the table, her voice carrying clearly, remarked to a nearby guest, a formidable dowager named Lady Ashworth, "It's so interesting, isn't it, how families can be so different? Michael is such a dear boy, of course, but his background, well, it's rather quaint, shall we say." Lady Ashworth, a woman known for her sharp intellect and even sharper tongue, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Different can be refreshing, Beatrice," she commented dryly, her gaze lingering on Eleanor with a curious, almost respectful intensity. This unexpected, albeit mild, defense from such a prominent figure seemed to momentarily throw Beatrice off her stride. But Clara, never one to miss an opportunity for malice, soon picked up the baton. During the speeches, after Arthur Pennington had delivered a rambling, self-congratulatory tribute to his daughter and his own good fortune, Clara rose to give her bridesmaid's toast. After a few token platitudes about Jessica, she turned her attention, with a saccharine smile, towards Eleanor. "And we mustn't forget Michael's dear grandmother, Mrs. Vance," Clara trilled, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "It's so touching that she could make the journey to be with us today. I know Michael was telling us that you live a very quiet life, Mrs. Vance, not accustomed to such grand occasions." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "But don't you worry," she continued, with a patronizing wink. "We'll make sure you're not too overwhelmed by all the excitement." The insult was egregious, a public attempt to patronize and diminish Eleanor in front of all the guests. A wave of embarrassed silence rippled through the marquee. Jessica's face turned crimson. Michael clenched his fists, his knuckles white, and was about to rise from his seat when Eleanor, with a calm that was almost unnerving, placed a restraining hand on his arm. She then turned her gaze towards Clara, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "Thank you for your concern, my dear Clara," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady, carrying surprisingly well in the sudden hush. "But I assure you, I have attended many grand occasions in my time. Some, perhaps, even grander than this one." She paused, her eyes twinkling with a hint of amusement that only Lady Ashworth, who was now watching with undisguised interest, seemed to catch. "The key, I've always found," Eleanor continued, "is not the grandeur of the occasion, but the grace and kindness of the hosts. And on that score, my dear, you and your family are proving most instructive." The double entendre, delivered with perfect poise, hung in the air. Clara's face flushed an unbecoming shade of puce. Beatrice looked aghast. Arthur sputtered indignantly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Lady Ashworth let out a small, appreciative chuckle, a sound that broke the tension and seemed to signal a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Many guests, who had been made uncomfortable by the Penningtons' boorishness, now looked at Eleanor with a newfound respect. The quiet, unassuming grandmother had just, with a few well-chosen words, put the arrogant young bridesmaid firmly in her place. Michael, looking at his grandmother with a mixture of awe and relief, felt a surge of pride. Jessica, despite her embarrassment, couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for Eleanor's quiet strength. The Penningtons, however, were fuming. Their public attempt to humiliate Eleanor had backfired spectacularly. They had expected her to be cowed, to shrink under their social superiority. Instead, she had met their rudeness with an unshakable dignity and a wit that was all the more effective for its subtlety. But the day was far from over, and the real shock, the one that would unravel the Penningtons' carefully constructed world entirely, was still to come. It was hovering just on the horizon, as inevitable as the setting of the sun, waiting for the perfect moment to make its grand entrance. And Eleanor Vance, with her quiet smile and her deep, knowing eyes, seemed to be the only one who wasn't surprised by its impending arrival. Just as the Penningtons were attempting to recover their social equilibrium, their faces tight with barely concealed fury after Eleanor's subtle but effective counter to Clara's insult, a ripple of excitement, entirely different in nature, began to spread through the marquee. Heads turned towards the entrance, and a hush fell over the chattering guests. A distinguished-looking man, impeccably dressed in a tailored Seville rose suit, had just entered, accompanied by a younger woman who carried herself with an air of quiet efficiency. The man was instantly recognizable to many in the room, particularly those who moved in the higher echelons of finance and international diplomacy. He was Sir Reginald Carmichael, a renowned philanthropist, a former ambassador to several key European nations, and the chairman of one of the world's largest charitable foundations. His presence at any event was a mark of significant prestige, and the Penningtons, who had sent him an invitation more out of hopeful aspiration than genuine expectation, were momentarily stunned into silence. Beatrice recovered first, her eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and dawning triumph. Sir Reginald Carmichael here, at her daughter's wedding. This was a social coup of the highest order. She immediately began to move towards him, her earlier pique forgotten, her face wreathed in a welcoming smile. "Sir Reginald," she gushed, extending her hand. "What an unexpected honor. We are so utterly thrilled you could join us." Sir Reginald, a man of immense charm and understated gravitas, smiled politely. "Beatrice, my dear. Arthur, à lovely occasion." His gaze, however, swept past them, scanning the room with a focused intensity. And then he saw her. His eyes lit up with genuine warmth and affection. Ignoring the outstretched hands of several other socialites eager to greet him, Sir Reginald moved with surprising alacrity directly towards the main family table. He walked straight past Beatrice and Arthur, straight past a bewildered Clara, and stopped directly in front of Eleanor Vance. The entire marquee seemed to hold its breath. The Penningtons watched, their smiles frozen, a dawning sense of confusion, and perhaps a flicker of unease beginning to cloud their faces. "Ellie, my dearest Ellie," Sir Reginald exclaimed, his voice filled with a warmth that was unmistakably genuine. He took both of Eleanor's hands in his eyes twinkling. "You look as radiant as ever. Forgive my tardiness. A rather tiresome board meeting ran unexpectedly late." Eleanor smiled, her own eyes shining with affection. "Reggie," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "How wonderful of you to come. I know how terribly busy you always are." The Penningtons exchanged bewildered glances. "Ellie? Reggie?" The easy familiarity between the distinguished Sir Reginald Carmichael and Michael's quaint grandmother was utterly inexplicable to them. Lady Ashworth, however, was observing the scene with a knowing smile, as if a particularly interesting puzzle piece had just clicked into place. Sir Reginald then turned to Michael and Jessica, his smile encompassing them both. "Michael, my boy, your grandmother has told me so much about you. A fine young man. And Jessica, my dear, you are as lovely as Ellie described. My warmest congratulations to you both." He then produced a small, elegantly wrapped gift from his pocket, handing it to Jessica. "A little something from an old friend of the family," he said with a wink. Jessica, flustered and overwhelmed, stammered her thanks. Michael, though equally surprised by Sir Reginald's arrival and his obvious affection for his grandmother, managed a more composed, "Thank you, Sir Reginald. It means a great deal to us, and especially to Grandma, that you're here." Beatrice, recovering from her initial shock, bustled forward, eager to reclaim the spotlight and associate herself with such an esteemed guest. "Sir Reginald, you must come and meet some of our other friends. We have a table reserved for our most honored guests." Sir Reginald, however, gently disengaged himself. "Thank you, Beatrice, but if you don't mind, I'd much prefer to sit with my dear friend Ellie. We have so much catching up to do." He then, to the utter astonishment of the Penningtons, pulled up a chair beside Eleanor, engaging her in an animated, affectionate conversation, completely oblivious, it seemed, to the social tsunami he had just unleashed. The other guests were now buzzing with speculation. Who was Eleanor Vance? How did she know Sir Reginald Carmichael so intimately? The Penningtons' carefully constructed narrative of her being a simple, insignificant old woman was beginning to unravel at an alarming speed. Clara looked utterly mortified, her earlier smugness replaced by a horrified realization that she had grievously misjudged and publicly insulted someone who was clearly far more important than she had ever imagined. Arthur Pennington was sweating, his florid face now a shade paler. Beatrice's smile was fixed, a brittle rictus of social panic. The shock had begun, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating arrival of an old friend. And as Eleanor and Sir Reginald chatted easily, their conversation punctuated by shared laughter and warm reminiscences, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The full extent of Eleanor Vance's hidden life and the true depth of the Penningtons' folly was about to be laid bare for all to see. The air in the marquee crackled with unspoken questions, and the Penningtons, for the first time in a very long time, found themselves on the terrifyingly unfamiliar precipice of social irrelevance. The arrival of Sir Reginald Carmichael and his open, affectionate deference to Eleanor Vance had thrown the Penningtons into a state of barely concealed panic. Their meticulously planned wedding reception, intended as a showcase of their social standing, was rapidly devolving into a scene of their own public humiliation. Whispers rippled through the marquee like wildfire. Guests who had earlier mirrored the Penningtons' condescension towards Eleanor now eyed her with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Who was this woman, this Ellie, who could command such warmth from one of the world's most respected figures? Lady Ashworth, thoroughly enjoying the unfolding drama, leaned towards a bewildered Beatrice. "My dear Beatrice," she said, her voice laced with dry amusement, "it seems your new in-law is rather more connected than you surmised. One should never judge a book by its cover, you know, especially not when the cover is as elegantly understated as Mrs. Vance's." Beatrice could only manage a weak, strained smile. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of this bewildering turn of events. Sir Reginald, meanwhile, was regaling Eleanor with an amusing anecdote about a recent diplomatic incident, his voice carrying just enough for those at nearby tables to overhear snippets of their conversation. References to international summits, private audiences with world leaders, and complex philanthropic endeavors. It was a world far removed from the Penningtons' provincial social climbing. Then, as if on cue, another wave of distinguished guests began to arrive, these ones clearly having been delayed along with Sir Reginald. First came a renowned concert pianist, Maestro Julian Croft, whose performances sold out concert halls worldwide. He greeted Eleanor with a warm embrace and a kiss on both cheeks. "Eleanor, my darling, Forgive my lateness. You look wonderful. Next, a formidable woman with an unmistakable air of academic brilliance, Professor Anya Sharma, a Nobel laureate in economics, made a beeline for Eleanor, her face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. Ellie, I wouldn't have missed this for the world. Michael is a lucky man to have you. The Penningtons watched aghast as a succession of luminaries, a celebrated author, a prominent surgeon, even a retired four-star general, all greeted Eleanor Vance not as a quaint old grandmother, but as a cherished friend, a respected contemporary, an equal. Each arrival was like another nail in the coffin of their social pretensions. Clara had shrunk in her chair, her face pale, avoiding all eye contact. Arthur was mopping his brow with a handkerchief, his earlier bluster completely deflated. Beatrice looked as though she might faint. Michael and Jessica, though initially as surprised as everyone else by this parade of distinguished well-wishers, were now looking at Eleanor with a new understanding. Michael had always known his grandmother was special, a woman of quiet wisdom and immense inner strength. But he had never fully grasped the breadth and depth of the life she had lived, the circles in which she had moved. The full revelation came during the cake-cutting ceremony. As Michael and Jessica stood, knife poised, Sir Reginald Carmichael tapped his glass for attention. "If I may," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "I'd like to propose a toast, not just to the happy couple, whose love and happiness are a joy to witness, but also to a remarkable woman who has been a guiding light in my life and in the lives of many others here today." He turned towards Eleanor, his expression one of profound respect and affection. Many of you know Eleanor Vance as Michael's beloved grandmother, but some of you may not be aware of the extraordinary life she has led. Eleanor was not only a gifted concert pianist in her youth, gracing stages across Europe, but she was also the indispensable partner, the brilliant mind, and the compassionate heart behind her late husband, Ambassador David Vance, during his long and distinguished diplomatic career. A collective gasp went through the room. Ambassador David Vance. The name was legendary, synonymous with wisdom, integrity, and pivotal international negotiations. The Penningtons looked as though they had been struck by lightning. Eleanor, Sir Reginald continued, was his confidant, his advisor, his secret weapon. She hosted kings and presidents with effortless grace, navigated treacherous political waters with unparalleled skill, and all the while raised a fine family and dedicated herself to numerous quiet, unpublicized acts of philanthropy. She is a woman of immense intellect, profound compassion, and unshakable integrity. She has advised governments, championed human rights, and touched countless lives with her wisdom and her kindness. He raised his glass. To Eleanor Vance, a true stateswoman, a cherished friend, and the most remarkable grandmother a young man could ever hope for. "We salute you, Ellie." The Marquis erupted in applause, genuine and heartfelt. Guests rose to their feet, their faces filled with admiration and respect. The Penningtons remained seated, stunned into immobility, the full weight of their ignorance, their arrogance, their appalling misjudgment, crashing down upon them. They had mocked and belittled a woman who had dined with royalty, advised world leaders, and shaped international policy. They had dismissed as quaint a life that was richer, more significant, and infinitely more distinguished than their own could ever hope to be. The shock was complete, and it was devastating. Eleanor Vance, the quiet woman in the navy silk dress, simply smiled, a gentle, forgiving smile that encompassed everyone in the room, even the now utterly humiliated Penningtons. The tables had not just been turned, they had been completely, irrevocably, and gloriously upended. The thunderous applause for Eleanor Vance, led by Sir Reginald Carmichael and echoed by a room full of people who now understood her true stature, gradually subsided, leaving a palpable silence in its wake. All eyes were on the Pennington family, who sat frozen at the main table, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. Beatrice looked as though she had seen a ghost. Her carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of social climbing and perceived superiority, had just crumbled around her. Arthur's florid complexion had turned a sickly gray. He stared blankly ahead, his glass of champagne untouched. Clara, usually so quick with a cutting remark, was speechless, her eyes wide with a mortified understanding of her own colossal misjudgment. She had mocked a woman who was, by any meaningful measure, infinitely her superior. The humiliation was acute, a burning shame that spread through her like a fever. For several long moments, no one spoke. The festive atmosphere of the wedding reception had been replaced by a stunned, almost reverent silence. Then, slowly, Beatrice Pennington pushed back her chair and rose to her feet, her movements stiff and uncoordinated. She looked at Eleanor, her expression a confusing jumble of emotions. "Mrs. Vance." "Eleanor," she began, her voice trembling. I had no idea. We are so terribly ashamed." Her apology, if it could be called that, was halting, inadequate, born more of social panic than genuine remorse. Arthur managed to choke. "Indeed. A terrible misunderstanding. Please forgive our ignorance." Clara simply stared at her plate, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Eleanor looked at them, not with triumph, not with vindictiveness, but with a quiet, almost sorrowful compassion. She understood their shock, their embarrassment. She had seen such reactions before, from people who had mistaken her quiet demeanor for insignificance. "There is nothing to forgive, Mrs. Pennington, Mr. Pennington," Eleanor said, her voice calm and gentle. "Perhaps this has been an opportunity for all of us to remember that true worth is not always apparent on the surface." Her words, though softly spoken, carried the weight of a profound lesson. She wasn't interested in their humiliation. She was interested in fostering understanding, in gently guiding them towards a more enlightened perspective. Lady Ashworth, never one to let an opportunity for a pointed remark pass, leaned towards Beatrice. "Well, Beatrice," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hush, "it seems you've managed to insult one of the most distinguished women in the country. Quite an achievement, even for you." Beatrice flushed a deep, painful red, but said nothing. The other guests began to murmur amongst themselves, their earlier whispers of speculation now replaced by expressions of admiration for Eleanor and thinly veiled contempt for the Penningtons. The social currency the Penningtons had so desperately coveted was now devalued, their reputation irrevocably tarnished by their own snobbery and ignorance. Michael and Jessica, who had watched this entire scene unfold with a mixture of astonishment and relief, now moved to Eleanor's side. Michael put a protective arm around his grandmother. "Grandma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so incredibly proud to be your grandson." Jessica, her eyes filled with tears,